It was the summer of 2007 when 5 friends, Daniel, Chris, Megan, Lauren, and Jake, decided to escape the noise of the city and spend a long weekend camping deep in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. They were all in their early 20s, college friends who hadn't seen each other in months, and the idea of campfires, beer, and late-night talks under the stars sounded perfect. The first 2 nights were peaceful. They hiked trails during the day, swam in the nearby creek, and spent their evenings laughing around the fire. But on the 3rd night, things changed. Jake was the one who first noticed something was off. He said he heard footsteps circling their camp around 2 a.m. At first, everyone brushed it off as maybe a deer or raccoon, but the sound was heavy, deliberate, like a person trying to be quiet but not quiet enough. Daniel even joked that it was probably another camper lost in the woods. They laughed, but deep down, each of them felt uneasy. The next morning, Chris mentioned he had woken up to the sound of whispering. He swore it wasn't a dream. He described it as a hushed conversation, like 2 voices speaking just beyond the thin fabric of his tent. Nobody else claimed to hear it, but Megan noticed that the fire pit had been disturbed, as if someone had stepped on the ashes. That night, they agreed to keep the fire burning longer, hoping light would scare away whatever or whoever was out there. By 1 a.m., everyone had dozed off except Jake, who volunteered to keep watch. He sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, when suddenly he heard snapping branches to the east. He pointed his flashlight, but saw nothing. Then, a faint figure appeared between the trees, too far to make out details. Thinking it might be another hiker, he called out. The figure didn't answer. It just turned and slowly walked deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, Jake followed, yelling for the person to stop. The others awoke around 2:30 a.m. to find Jake missing. At first, they assumed he had just wandered to relieve himself, but when 30 minutes passed, panic set in. Daniel and Chris grabbed flashlights and went looking for him, while the girls stayed behind at camp. Hours passed, and there was no sign of Jake. His backpack, boots, and even his phone were still at the campsite. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. At sunrise, the group packed up quickly and drove to the nearest ranger station to report him missing. The search lasted 3 weeks. Dogs, helicopters, dozens of volunteers scouring the forest. Nothing. Not a single piece of clothing. Not even footprints were found beyond the first 100 yards from camp. Authorities couldn't explain it. His family was devastated, and the rest of the group never camped again. The strangest detail came later, when Lauren admitted something she had kept to herself. On the night Jake disappeared, just before she fell asleep, she swore she heard someone whisper her name from outside her tent. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but chilling enough to freeze her blood. She never told anyone until after the investigation. To this day, Jake's case remains unsolved. Some believe he was lured by whoever was stalking the camp. Others say the forest took him, as if it swallowed him whole. The friends have moved on with their lives, but none of them can forget the look of that empty tent the next morning, or the echoes of whispers in the woods that seemed to follow them, even after they left. In the summer of 2011, 2 cousins, Michael and Aaron, both 19, planned a short weekend camping trip near the Delaware River in New Jersey. They wanted to fish, relax, and get away from the stress of their summer jobs. They picked a secluded spot about a mile from the main trail and set up camp on a small ridge overlooking the water. The first day went perfectly. They caught a few fish, cooked them over a small fire, and watched the sunset bleed across the tree line. By midnight, they were lying in their tents, laughing and talking, when they both suddenly froze at the exact same sound. A scream. It wasn't an animal. Both of them had been in the woods long enough to know the difference. This was human, high-pitched, desperate, and echoing from somewhere across the river. They unzipped their tents and listened. For nearly a minute, silence pressed against their ears before the scream came again, this time even louder. Michael wanted to grab a flashlight and investigate. Aaron, more cautious, argued that crossing the river at night was dangerous and stupid. They debated in whispers until the scream turned into a sound neither of them could forget. A guttural, choking sob. It was close enough now that they swore it was on their side of the water. They kept the fire burning and sat up all night, clutching the hatchet they brought for chopping wood. No one approached, but the screaming didn't stop until just before dawn. The next morning, they searched the woods near their camp. No footprints, no sign of a struggle. The area was silent, except for the usual birds and insects. They tried to brush it off, convincing themselves it might have been some drunk locals messing around. By the afternoon, they almost laughed about it. But that night, the screams returned. Louder, closer, and more horrific. They sounded like multiple voices, all crying out at once. Sometimes it was a woman shrieking, sometimes a child, and sometimes something too distorted to even describe. Michael swore he heard someone yell his name, though Aaron said he was imagining things. Terrified, they decided to leave first thing in the morning. They packed most of their gear before crawling into their tents, but neither of them really slept. Around 3 a.m., the screams erupted again, this time directly behind their campsite. Michael tore open his tent and shined his flashlight into the trees. For just a split second, he saw movement, a tall, thin shape darting between the pines. He shouted, and Aaron leapt out to look too, but the figure was gone. What chilled them most wasn't what they saw, but what they heard. Faint splashes in the river, as if someone or something was retreating into the water. They left before the sun was fully up, abandoning their fire pit, gear, even some food. When they reached the ranger station, they reported what happened. The ranger, an older man who had worked there for decades, just frowned and shook his head. He told them they weren't the first campers to hear screams by the river. According to him, locals whispered about a tragic accident from the 1960s. A small boat carrying a family capsized in that stretch of the river. The parents drowned trying to save their children, and none of the bodies were ever recovered. Fishermen still claimed to hear their cries at night. Michael and Aaron never camped there again. In fact, Michael swore off camping entirely. But the worst part came weeks later, when Aaron went to develop the disposable camera he had brought on the trip. Among the usual photos of fish and trees, there was one picture they didn't remember taking. In October 2015, 3 college friends, Samantha, Rachel, and Tyler, decided to spend a weekend camping in a place locals called Black Hollow Woods, a stretch of forest in West Virginia that had a reputation for being haunted. They weren't firm believers in ghost stories, but Samantha had read online about people claiming to see strange lights and hear voices in the woods at night. To them, it sounded like the perfect Halloween adventure. They arrived late Friday afternoon, set up camp, and by nightfall, they were sitting by the fire, telling ghost stories. The woods felt heavier than usual, quiet, almost too quiet. Rachel commented that she hadn't heard a single owl or coyote since they arrived. Around midnight, Tyler decided to go gather more wood. He had only been gone a few minutes when Samantha and Rachel heard him yell something. At first, they thought he was joking, but when his voice cracked with real fear, they grabbed a flashlight and ran toward him. They found him standing rigid in a small clearing, pointing toward the trees. "What is it?" Samantha asked, breathless. Tyler's voice shook. "I saw someone right there." Watching us, they shined the light in the direction he pointed, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. They tried to laugh it off, but Tyler swore he wasn't imagining things. He described a tall figure with pale skin, standing unnaturally still between the trees. Uneasy, they returned to camp and decided to stick close together for the night. By 2 a.m., Samantha had just begun to drift off when a sound pulled her awake. A low humming, almost like a lullaby, floating just outside the tent. She held her breath, praying it was Rachel or Tyler. But both were asleep beside her. The humming grew louder, circling the tent, before fading into the trees. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, they considered leaving early, but curiosity won out. They explored deeper into the woods, eventually stumbling across something unsettling. An old foundation of what must have once been a cabin. The stone walls were crumbling, the chimney collapsed, but what stood out were the carvings on the remaining stones. Strange symbols, some resembling stick figures, others like runes, covered the foundation. Tyler, always the skeptic, tried to dismiss it as graffiti from bored kids. But Samantha and Rachel felt uneasy standing there, as if they weren't supposed to be near that place. That night, the woods came alive with sounds, twigs snapping, rustling leaves, heavy footsteps circling their campsite. Then came the whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the voices were distinct, murmuring, overlapping, speaking words they couldn't understand. Rachel clutched Samantha's arms so tightly, her nails dug into her skin. Tyler shouted into the darkness, demanding whoever it was to show themselves. The forest answered with silence. Moments later, the whispering stopped, replaced by a single loud crash, like a tree falling just beyond the ridge. The three of them didn't move, didn't speak. They stayed huddled by the dying fire until dawn. The final straw came on the third night. Exhausted and frightened, they decided to leave first thing in the morning. But as they packed their things at dusk, Samantha noticed something terrifying. Hanging from a tree near their camp was a bundle of twigs tied together in the shape of a small human figure. None of them had seen it the day before. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time they closed their eyes, the sound of footsteps returned, closer and closer. Around 3 a.m., Rachel screamed. She claimed she had opened her eyes to see a face pressed against the thin fabric of the tent, pale and grinning before it vanished into the dark. By morning, they fled the woods, leaving most of their gear behind. Years later, when Samantha retold the story, she admitted something she never told Rachel or Tyler. On their last night, while the whispers surrounded the camp, she heard her own name spoken clearly, drawn out slowly, almost lovingly, from somewhere just beyond the firelight. To this day, none of them have returned to Black Hollow Woods. Locals still say the land is cursed, that whatever once lived in that old cabin never really left. And when the wind is just right, some swear they can still hear humming drifting through the trees. In the summer of 2018, 4 friends, David, Clara, Ben, and Sophia, planned a weekend getaway to camp in the dense pine forest near Mount Shasta in Northern California. The area was famous for its hiking trails and crystal-clear lakes, but locals also whispered strange stories about disappearances and sightings of figures that didn't belong. The friends laughed off the tales, confident that the only thing they had to worry about were bears. The first night was calm. They roasted marshmallows, told jokes, and settled into their tents under a sky so full of stars it almost didn't feel real. Around 2 a.m., Clara woke up to the sound of crunching leaves outside her tent. She froze, listening. At first, she thought it was Ben getting up to use the woods, but when the footsteps grew heavier and began circling her tent, she knew something was wrong. She whispered David's name, who was in the tent next to hers. He whispered back, terrified. "You hear it too?" They lay there, silent, as the footsteps moved between the tents before fading into the forest. No one dared to go outside. The next day, they checked the campsite, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken branches. They decided not to mention it again, hoping not to ruin the trip. By evening, they were sitting by the fire when Ben suddenly pointed into the trees. "Do you see that?" he whispered. All three turned and saw it too. A man, standing perfectly still between two trees, half hidden by shadow. He was tall, unnaturally thin, and facing directly toward them. Clara called out, asking if he was lost or needed help. The man didn't answer. He didn't even move. He just stood there, watching. Sophia grabbed the flashlight and shined it at him. That's when they saw it. His face was pale, almost gray, but the detail that froze them all was his eyes, or rather, the lack of them. Where his eyes should have been were only dark, empty hollows. The man turned and slipped into the darkness without a sound. The group sat frozen for nearly 10 minutes before scrambling to douse the fire and retreat into their tents. Nobody slept that night. By morning, they debated leaving, but Ben insisted it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe another camper messing with them. Against their better judgment, they stayed. That night, the woods grew oppressively silent. Not even the insects chirped. Around 1 a.m., Clara heard it again, footsteps slowly circling their camp. Then came the humming, low and broken, like someone trying to remember a tune. David swore the humming was right outside his tent flap. Suddenly, Sophia screamed. She said she felt someone press a hand against the outside of her tent, slowly dragging it across the fabric. When they all rushed out with flashlights, the camp was empty. The forest looked undisturbed, yet the smell of damp earth and something foul lingered in the air. The final horror came just before dawn. David, unable to sleep, sat near the dying fire. He noticed movement at the edge of the clearing and lifted his light. There he was again, the man with no eyes, standing in the exact same spot as before, only this time closer. He raised one hand slowly, as if pointing directly at David. That was enough. As soon as the sun rose, they packed their things in silence and left most of their gear behind. None of them ever spoke of it again, except Clara, who years later confessed something chilling. On their last night, just before Sophia screamed, she swore she heard a voice whisper inside her head, not outside the tent. 3 words that made her blood run cold. "You are mine." To this day, whenever Clara closes her eyes at night, she sees that hollow face watching her from the trees.